Hi, I'm Jeremy Pomeroy. I'm a research scientist at the BBS Center at Marshfield Clinic. This is my third BBS Family Association conference, first virtual. I miss getting to meet everyone as I have in the years past that I attended, but I'm glad to be here today and to have the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to be talking a little bit about physical activity and sleep behavior. Over the past few years, we conducted a study here where we sent out actigraph monitors that are wrist-worn monitors, sort of like a Fitbit or something like that, to record activity and sleep behavior. We sent them out to participants in the Cribs registry. They wore the devices for about 12 days and then sent them back to us, and then I analyzed the data. And I want to share some of those results today and also then use some of those findings to provide some general recommendations about some physical activity and sleep behavior. So first, what I want to talk about, though, is just some background on some benefits of physical activity. And you know, physical activity is a term that's used quite a bit, but doesn't always mean the exact same thing. And so what I want to specifically talk about is any type of movement that's above resting or sedentary behavior, which is something that we refer to, you know, sitting time and other behaviors like that. Exercise is one type of physical activity, and that's a structured type of physical activity. It's often of a higher intensity than just kind of slowly walking around or doing activities of daily living. Movement of any intensity, though, has important benefits, including in things like improving mood, helping to maintain focus, and then also things like helping to maintain blood pressure control, glucose control. Specifically with glucose control during movement, muscles that are contracting, they take up glucose, which is called contraction-stimulated glucose uptake. And then for a period of time after the movement stopped, those same muscles are also more attuned to taking up glucose. And so activities that involve more muscles are better at glucose uptake and than activities that use fewer muscles. But that, just any type of movement is beneficial in that regard. So one of the last things that I want to mention about physical activity is a question that often comes up is the role of physical activity in weight management. And while movement does increase energy expenditure, people often find that starting exercise program or increasing physical activity doesn't really lead to very significant changes in weight, particularly weight loss, without making some pretty substantial changes in diet as well. And I bring it up because I don't want anyone to feel discouraged and instead to focus on the other benefits of physical activity and exercise. One of the things I often recommend is to focus on gauging success by improvements in mood and well-being over changes in weight. So I talked about activity across the entire range, but what I really want to focus on right now is sedentary time. One of the most effective ways to increase physical activity is to focus on interrupting sedentary time, particularly prolonged sedentary time. And so what I'm talking about is long periods of time, say, spent sitting. Prolonged sedentary time, which is periods of 20 minutes or more, have some negative impacts on health, and that's why it's an important target of behavior. Interrupting sedentary time can happen in periods as short as 2 minutes. Getting up, moving around is sufficient to reverse some of the negative things that start to happen during prolonged periods of sitting time. So one of the things that I looked at in the actigraph study that I mentioned before was sedentary time, and particularly prolonged sedentary time during the awake period. The bouts were 20 minutes or more, and it ended after 20 minutes, after 2 minutes of movement above sedentary. The participants in the actigraph study ranged from as young as 3 years old all the way up into their 60s. I compared people who were less than 20 years of age to people who were 20 and older. And what I found was that people who were under 20 averaged about 2 hours of prolonged sedentary time per day. Their average length of an individual bout was about 36 minutes, and people under the age of 20 averaged about 3 of those bouts a day. What I found was that people who were 20 and over spent considerably more time sedentary each day. It was about 3 hours and 45 minutes compared to about 2 hours. The average length of a bout, though, was just a little bit shorter, but not really meaningfully so. They were about 30 minutes instead of 36. But people who were 20 and over did have more bouts each day. They had about 5 prolonged sedentary bouts a day compared to 3. So, and that's fairly common for a lot of other studies that I've done, that, adults tend to be sedentary a bit more and have more time sedentary, more bouts of prolonged sedentary behavior each day. So I want to talk about some tips for reducing prolonged sedentary time. So this is an area where technology can come in handy. That devices like Fitbit or other activity trackers or Apple Watches or even some apps on smartphones will provide a reminder, usually through like a vibration or some type of alarm, when they've detected a bout of prolonged sedentary time. For people that don't use those Apple Watches, activity trackers, or smartphones or whatever, another way to use some technology is to just set a timer during a period, when you sit down and you're going to be sitting for a period of time. Set a timer for, say, 15 minutes or 18 minutes or something that will provide a reminder to get up before the bout has reached 20 minutes. Get up, move around for about 2 minutes, and then you can go back to sitting if required, or if you can make the break longer, that's great too. Besides reminders to interrupt prolonged sedentary time, some other useful tools can include trying to introduce movement to behaviors that previously were sedentary. So, for example, doing something like listening to a book on tape, or a recording of a book, or listening to podcasts, or even having the TV on or something like that. Instead of sitting during those activities, standing, moving around a little bit is another way to reduce those prolonged bouts of sedentary time. So if anyone has any questions or would like any individual help with this, we are accepting questions in response to this presentation, but also getting in touch with Sonia Suda. She will pass those along to me, and I can reach out. And like I said, general questions, or if anyone wants any individual help with preventing prolonged sedentary time, I'm more than happy to help. The other behavior that I want to talk about today is sleep behavior. And that's another key behavior that we can evaluate using the Actigraph data. When we're looking at sleep, we're typically looking at 2 main areas: the quantity of sleep, which we call sleep duration, and then there are various measures of sleep quality, how well people sleep. I'm going to focus a little bit more today on the duration issue because I had some findings that I think are important to bring up to the BBS community. So sleep duration looks at the total amount of sleep per night. In this analysis, I didn't look at naps. It's something I plan to look at in the future, but I'm just talking now about the total amount of sleep that occurs on a given night. The recommended amount of sleep that a person gets varies based on their age. Younger people are recommended to get more sleep than adults. The sleep recommendations are also usually presented as a range. So, for example, adolescents are recommended to get 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night. In the Actigraph study, one of the things that I did was to look at what percentage of the minimum recommendation were people getting. So for example, if an adolescent averaged 7 hours of sleep per night, then they were averaging 87.5% of the recommended 8 hours of sleep. And so this is a way to know, not just looking at the pure sleep duration, but how close are people getting to what the recommendation is for their age. What I found was that both for people under 20 and for people 20 and older, getting less than the minimum recommended amount of sleep was very, very common. People who were under 20 years of age got on average 79% of the minimum recommendation for their age, and people over 20 got on average 74% of the minimum recommendation for their age. Only 10% of the people who participated in our study got the minimum recommended amount of sleep for their age. So this is an area where I think that there's a lot of potential to improve. And the reality is that these findings are not necessarily that uncommon for anyone. That getting less than the recommended amount of sleep is unfortunately very, very common. So getting the recommended amount of sleep, or getting an adequate amount of sleep, is very important to health and well-being. People who go to bed and get up at a consistent time each day are more likely to get the recommended amount of sleep. I know that this can be a challenge when work or school schedules require waking up earlier than preferred. One of the things to try to do to maintain a regular sleep schedule is to avoid staying up late on certain nights, typically weekends, because that can make getting into the routine harder. Avoiding caffeine, particularly within 6 hours of bedtime, it will also make it easier to fall asleep as well as to stay asleep. Another thing, so I talked about physical activity earlier. Being physically active during the day can help. I discussed prolonged sedentary time. People who have more prolonged sedentary time in a day are also less likely to meet their sleep recommendations later. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that strenuous activity within 1 to 2 hours of bedtime can interfere with sleep. And the reason why that happens is because one of the cues that our body uses to know when it's time to sleep is our core body temperature. During the night, our core body temperature drops. Exercise, particularly strenuous exercise, increases core body temperature. So increasing core body temperature too close to bedtime essentially is tricking your body into thinking that it's time to be awake. So physical activity is beneficial to improve the amount of sleep someone gets, but lighter activity later in the evening is preferred over more strenuous activity. As with my comments about physical activity, if anyone has any questions, feel free to respond to this presentation, or for individual questions, also feel free to reach out to Sonia for any questions. Thank you very much for your time today. And I also want to give a very special thanks to the participants in the ActiGraph study.